Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Book to Action 2021 series. This is our final event. It's Pastures of Plenty Radio Recap. For more information on any of the programs in the Book to Action series, please visit santacruzpl.org, and this event is being recorded. If you have any questions for our guest, please use the chat feature. If you're on a computer, your Zoom control bar is located near the bottom of your screen, so you might see audio settings or a microphone over to the left, and then you'll see the chat icon somewhere. And then over on the very right-hand side, you'll see Leave in a red rectangle. And then if you're on mobile, you'll see Leave Meeting in red letters in the upper left corner, the chat icon over to the right. Now I'm going to turn this over to Diane Cowan with Santa Cruz Public Libraries to get started.
Good morning. I'm Diane Cowan. As Sarah mentioned, I'm with SCPL, and I'm really pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Rachel Ann Goodman. Rachel is the chair of the board of directors for KSQD Community Radio and a longtime radio producer. She teaches journalism also at Cabrillo College and science communications at UCSC. She's also a great musician, and we're really glad to have her today to discuss her work on the Pastures of Plenty project. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. It's really my great honor to be here to share this project with you. And I can't tell you how excited I am to still be talking about this and sharing about it all these years later, because it's a timeless story. So what I wanted to do today was really share a lot of the images and audio that I collected during my time. It was in 2005 through 2007 that I produced this with the support of Cal Humanities. It used to be called the California Humanities Council. And I have recognized that some of you have listened to some of it, but that's not necessary to actually get a lot out of this presentation because it is pretty complete. I just took a bunch of excerpts from the show and I took a lot of the images. I had an intern, Jay Molina, traveling with me around California and photographing a lot of the farm workers that we met. So as I mentioned, this was produced and distributed throughout the public radio system in 2006. But it was recently re-aired as part of this collaboration with the library on KSQD radio on Thursday nights. So I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit, and then I'm going to leave time at the end for questions. But if you wanted to raise your hand in the middle, we can stop and pause and address anything that comes up as we go along. I have about 40 minutes of material to share that's audio and visual, and that will leave time at the end for any comments and questions, if that sounds all right with you. And thank you again for joining me on a Saturday morning. I realize people are busy on Saturdays, and I'm really happy this is being recorded. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is Pastures of Plenty, and I was really happy to be able to secure Luis Valdez, who you'll hear a lot during this program, as my host, who did a lot of the narration along with me. So this is the intro to the whole series. It was 4 parts. The first part was about the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos who came into the fields as early as the 1840s, all the way through the 50s. And the second part is the Dust Bowl and the Depression and European immigrants. Third is Mexican immigrants. And fourth is what's going to happen to the future of farm labor given immigration restrictions. So that's kind of where we'll go in that order. And a lot of these voices and faces are from Santa Cruz County, and you'll see that as we go along.
Welcome to Pastures of Plenty, a history of California farm workers. I'm your host, Luis Valdez. Did you eat your vegetables today? If you did, it's likely what you ate came from California, where it was planted, cultivated, and harvested by farm workers. Bindlestiffs, coolies, okies, sacadas, campesinos. The words evoke images of people bent over rows, far from our view.
Instead of these huddled figures that are way off in a distance, those are people. People like my grandfather, your grandfather, everybody's grandmother. People need to understand that.
On low tide, she used to take this old horse and a plow and plow the sand, and all of these clams would come up.
My grandfather came here in the 1800s.
My father, who was an immigrant from Italy, in 1923 worked these ranches.
In California, it's really, with very few exceptions, every immigrant group came in to the field. That's the Ellis Island of California, is the fields, the furrow, the ditch. We all come through the ditch.
People on the margins, necessary but unknown. Their story is a fundamental piece of America's history.
The farm labor is still one of the most exploited situations in America.
Sleeping in a car or under the bridge, wasn't really, we were kids, wasn't really that bad.
They cut the wages and we don't like it.
And the current debate over illegal immigration has its roots here.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So as these three immigrant groups that I'm going to talk about and we're going to hear about entered the fields, each one brought different farming skills. A lot of people think unnecessarily that farm labor is unskilled, but actually a lot of people were working in agriculture before they came here, and they brought particular skills. The Chinese brought skills to produce fruit, and they planted a lot of the pear orchards that we see up and down the Sacramento Delta. So I interviewed a lot of people from that community, both in the San Jose area and also up further through the Delta. So we'll listen to this next clip. The year is 1881, and the Pearl River Delta in China is racked by civil war. A sharecropper's fourth son, Qin Liang, has been told he must leave home. There is no land for him to farm, so he decides to try his luck on Gold Mountain, the shimmering promise of wealth in California.
Husband says he's going to Golden Mountain and doesn't listen to my pleas. In the still of night, full of thoughts, I cannot rest my eyes. We may become rich, but wealthy is really nothing. Gold Mountain Song.
Leaving his family behind, Qin Liang borrows money from relatives and books passage on a steamship bound for San Francisco. And luck smiles on him.
When he first arrived, he actually worked in San Francisco. Then he was recruited to go to the Sacramento, Stockton area to work on a potato farm. And because he could speak enough English, he's one of the few Chinese that actually became a big farmer, and he was known as the Potato King. And he had, at one point, 500 Chinese workers. And in his best year, in 1910, he made $90,000 one year.
That's $90,000 in 1910 dollars. So that was a lot of money. So I traveled up to this beautiful town called Locke, which is a kind of a ghost town, but it was a thriving metropolis when most of the Chinese laborers came off of building the Transcontinental Railroad. And then they started draining the levees and building the levees and building pear orchards. And a lot of those orchards are actually still around Locke and Walnut Grove up in that area. So this is a picture of Ping Li. He's called the unofficial mayor of Locke, and Connie King, who ran the museum. Both of these people are gone from the earth now, but I was lucky to interview them, and they remember Locke when they were children. Next slide, please. Founded in 1912 by Tin Sin Chang, on this site, this unique Chinese community grew rapidly after a fire destroyed the Chinese section of Walnut Grove in 1915. At one time, the town had a population of 1,500, with a theater, hotel, school, church, 9 grocery stores, and 6 restaurants, a bakery, a lodge, and a post office. The entire town is Chinese architecture, and the original buildings are still standing, so you can go there and visit Locke if you would like. Next slide, please. This is Ping Li, and we're going to listen to a little of him talking, and you'll hear some Chinese spoken as well. You can see these old buildings leaning in. They're still standing, though. A few miles down the Sacramento River from Chan's farm, you'll find the town of Locke. It's one of the last rural Chinatowns in the United States and on the National Register of Historic Places. You can still see the old brothels and gambling houses as you walk the narrow avenue between the whitewashed buildings. Their warped balconies lean in toward each other now, as if whispering long-forgotten secrets. Ping Li's father helped start this town back in 1913.
The unique part of this town, I guess everybody knows by now, is I think it's the only Chinese-built town for the Chinese that is left in the United States. Before, these Chinatowns were all just catering to the Chinese that was working on the farms. These are the people that comes in these Chinatowns to buy the provisions and look for a little entertainment. You got to remember, they're all single people. They have no family. They just came over here just like the Mexican help today in Lock alone in the streets on the pear season. You probably see 400 or 500 people around, 3 gambling houses. Hey Clarence, 你今日嗰個 museum 開唔開啊？哦，閂咗啦嘛。佢中意睇下。
Longtime Lock resident Connie King, born in 1923, shows me the old gambling hall. It's now preserved as a museum, with all the old games still sitting there as if awaiting customers.
It's open. You can go and take a picture.
Yeah, let's do.
Yeah, because hi, Carol. Each table have a different kind of games, and this is how when the men get off work, this is where they play game, and they have a.
That's where you'd cash out when you were done.
See, this is where you play lottery. See, See, go in there.
Okay, next slide, please. There's the gambling hall. It says what kind of games you can play at the top there and what time they're happening. It was a lottery. You might know or you might not know that the laws were incredibly cruel and they forbade the Chinese immigrant men from bringing over their wives. So they were incredibly lonely, and gambling was one way that they could entertain themselves, and drinking was another. There was nothing else to spend their wages on except to send them back home. Next slide, please. Right up the road was Wally Chan. He was still farming some of the same pear trees that the early immigrants had planted. And he showed me the label, Bartlett pears. And this was his father, Chong Chan. He was the patriarch who built the farm. And here's a little audio from Wally telling a little bit about his family story. You can just click the icon there on the audio next to Wally's picture on the left.
Oh. Okay, you're back.
Wally's picture on the left has an icon. You can just scroll over that and play the audio there. There we go.
I'm Wally Chan, and in Cortland. Here we are in the yard of the Chan Farms. This is our shop. It's my dad's house on the left. We're walking towards the pear trees.
Wally Chan is the third generation to farm this land. His grandfather arrived with the first big wave of Chinese farm workers to the Delta.
I don't know what made those guys do it, but somebody did it. Plant pear trees, and here they are. Yeah. Some of them over 100 years old, and they can live a long time. My grandpa came to the United States in the late 1800s, and he settled in San Francisco. And he was a merchant. He worked in a couple of stores out there, I think, in San Francisco. And then when the earthquake came, he decided he better get out of town and come to the Delta. So in 1906, he came to the Delta. His name was Chong Chan, C-H-A-N. Then he settled here in Cortland, 1935, something like that. In the early 1930s, I think, most of the orchards here were run by Chinese, and the pears were picked by Chinese and pruned by Chinese, and it was just the Chinese labor force. But they were all like brothers, and they shared and shared alike, most of them.
This land Sorry, I need to correct. That's his grandfather, not his father. So he's third generation. Thank you. All right, next slide, please. So we've seen this before, these various laws prohibiting particular immigrants from coming into our country. And as many Chinese came in the 1800s, there became a backlash, a really racist backlash. First one prohibiting them from bringing their wives, and the second was basically prohibiting all of them from coming, specifically from China. And this Chinese Exclusion Act really cut down the number of Chinese immigrants. And you saw like 80-year-olds in the fields from China with 40-year-olds from Japan. So there was a crossover. And sadly, today we see a movement called Stop Asian Hate. The fact that we have to have a movement called that in 2021 should make us all ponder how much history can repeat itself if we don't learn to understand each other better. So I think this is Sandy Lydon talking about this. He's a historian from Cabrillo, retired.
The standard line was they're taking work that others, non-Chinese, would like to have. It's that hollow argument that we hear even today. The line of people waiting to go into a swamp, right, with a pick and a shovel and a rake to turn that into arable land was very short.
So you might know Sandy Lydon from his talks at Cabrillo. He's an expert in the Chinese and Japanese immigration and farm work, and he's written several books about that that he's co-published with George Au, Sr. Let's go to the next slide, please. I had a lot of historians helping me with this project, and then I took a trip over to the Japanese History Museum in San Jose, which I highly recommend. And a lot of these images are from there. You can see these immigrant laborers from Japan that came over after the Chinese began to not be able to be here. They came and filled that niche. And this is Issei pioneer Yuakichi Tsukaye. He farmed in what is now Silicon Valley in San Jose, and he was also farming pears as well. Next slide, please. These are Japanese apple pickers in Watsonville. This is courtesy of the Pajaro Valley Historical Association. Yeah, these are some of the earliest images of Japanese farm workers that we have. Next slide. So as I mentioned, young male Japanese immigrants replaced older Chinese laborers in the orchards and fields of California, especially here on the Central Coast in Watsonville and Salinas. And although they began their lives as hired laborers, many became small farmers. They farmed with their families, and there was a loophole in immigration law that allowed Japanese women to enter the country to join their husbands. But like so many of these cruel laws, as soon as the ugly head of racism began to rear its head, they passed a new law in 1924 called the National Origins Act, which stopped Japanese immigration. Next slide, please. Here's some more pictures of pear sorting up in the upper left. You have women working in the fields as well. That's sometimes an overlooked reality, is women joined men in the fields and worked just as hard, if not harder, alongside them. Next, please. I met John Hayakawa. He's a lovely gentleman. His favorite thing was ballroom dancing. That's his big passion, but he grew up as a farm worker in San Jose, and a lot of us just don't think of San Jose as a farming place. But prior to all the high-rises, it was some of the most fertile land, and the entire Santa Clara Valley was called the Valley of Heart's Delight, and was just orchards as far as you could see. And here's John talking about that.
My name is John Y. Hayakawa. I was born in San Francisco on April the 2nd, 1918. Hooray, my 88th birthday. When I realized I was alive, I guess I was 3 or 4. That's all I saw was orchard and farm, orchard and farm. I didn't know San Jose existed other than this Japantown, And we were sharecropping till I was 17. And one of the times my father hit it big gambling. He bought a secondhand car.
He had a very sarcastic sense of humor, about as dry as you can get. A lot of the people I met, and of course, most of these people are gone now, because it's been since 2006 that I produced this. They were so generous with their time, and they so wanted to tell their story, and were so proud of their hard work and the origins that brought them to the United States. Next slide, please. This is one of the earliest pictures of farm laborers in Watsonville. You might recognize the background there. And often, we don't know who these people are because their faces are shrouded in shadow, but you can tell this is probably the 1800s, early 1900s, because of the way they're dressed. Imagine if you're a woman working in the strawberry fields or lettuce fields with a long dress and petticoats on. It would be very cumbersome and dirty. One thing you can bet on. All right, next slide. Another lovely person I met was Kei Azumizaki. She grew up farming in the Watsonville area. She has now also passed. And on the left is a picture of her. She's the one on the far right there with her sister and brother, two sisters and a brother, and her mother and father and uncle. And we can play the audio here of Kay talking about the early days in Watsonville growing food.
The Shikoku Island and the county of Ehime-ken, and my mother comes from the same part of that country also. They both came over by boat. I know my father never talked about it, but I remember my mother talking about how terrible it was to come steerage. But I remember him talking about, borrowing the horse and wagon and going after my mother and then driving her back. And she was being impressed to think that the horse and wagon was his. And as he rode close by the house, this is the boss's house, oh, what a lovely place. And then keeps on going to the, like the chicken coop-like place, where they all, but that was the way it was.
That was the way it was. You'll notice that the apple trees are planted right in the rows of strawberries.
Shikoku Island. And
can you pause that? Yeah, so we have orchards and strawberries in the same place, which is an interesting way of replanting. You don't see that very often anymore. Next slide, please. This is Kay's family in 1913, her mother driving a very skinny horse. It was not an easy life. Next slide, please. This is Jim Kawasaki. It's amazing, this farm he had when I visited him. It was surrounded by high-rise buildings. It was like 2 acres, the original Ikawe farms, and that it was his father-in-law's farm. And he was still farming it, and he had been offered millions of dollars to sell out, but he refused. He just said, I've got to keep farming this land because it was my family's farm, and they farm completely organically, and they always have. So the idea that organic farming is something relatively new is not really true. A lot of people practiced it quite early on. Next slide, please. This is Jimmy Yamaichi. He became very active in the restitution movement, trying to get the U.S. government to pay victims of the internment camps that happened during World War II. He was retired from farming. By the time I met him, he was into carving wood. And here's him talking a little bit about their early work in the fields around San Jose.
My name is Jim Yamaichi, born and raised here in San Jose, the area called Berryessa. They call East San Jose today. That's my home base as I grew up as a farm boy. So I did my lion's shares of work.
There were 10 kids?
10 kids, yeah.
And what number are you?
Number 4. I'm number 4. So.
And when were you born?
1922. We used to pick anise. When it rains, they have to pack that out. And each one of those crate weighs like 85 to 90 pounds. Put that on your back and with boots on and with mud, and you're walking down the furrows. So that and carrying out the cabbage was just to kill us. As a youngster, you're only 15, 16 years old, and you're putting 100 pounds on your back and slushing through.
A lot of Japanese farmers, when they were sent away to internment camps, lost their farms. They went from sharecropper to owning small plots of land because the younger generation was allowed to own land, whereas the original settlers were not because of anti-immigration laws and fears about loyalty. So a lot of them found themselves at a real disadvantage when they returned. A lot of their farms had been taken from them. Next slide. So when the Japanese stopped coming because of anti-immigration laws aimed specifically at them, Filipinos began to come in around 1934. Around the 1920s, sorry. But in 1934, there was another law that restricted Filipino immigration, even though originally they were a protectorate, a colony of the U.S. So it's a complex relationship. Different from other immigrants, the Filipino immigrants were highly educated. They had been educated in English using American textbooks. So they had a very different view of what the United States was supposed to be like and how they were supposed to be integrated. When they got here, there was quite a shock to them when they found the only jobs they could get were agricultural jobs. And as with the previous two groups we've been talking about, there was a lot of discrimination against them. There's a famous race riot that broke out in Watsonville where somebody was killed, Fermin Tobera, and it was a real tragedy and quite famous in agricultural history and sad chapter. Because they were not allowed to bring their wives, they often had parties with Caucasian women, and this caused some of the Caucasian men in Watsonville to object to their visiting. Anyway, that's what sparked that riot, and it became a fatal one. Next slide, please. Al Baggio is a lovely gentleman who is very interested in local history that I met. He's pictured center there and on the left. Next slide, please. He lives in Salinas.
By the time
There we go. Can you go back and play that audio? I'm sorry. Thank you. It's right at the top there. Thanks.
By the time Al Baggio started working in the lettuce fields in the 1950s, wages had improved to $1 an hour, but the work was still unchanged.
When I was growing up, I worked in the fields during the summer, and we had to use those short hose, what they call cortitos, and that was backbreaking work to, when you're thinning lettuce. The working conditions were deplorable. Like I can remember getting up at 6:30 in the morning, be out in the field by 7 o'clock, then work from 7 to 10. And then we took a 15-minute break. Then we had lunch for an hour. Then we worked from 1 to 6 o'clock at night with a 3 o'clock break.
Al Baggio remembers his father, a Filipino Union man, packed a rifle with him just to go grocery shopping for his own protection.
What the growers did was divided and conquered, because most of the packing shed workers were Caucasians, and they work in the packing sheds, and most of the field workers were Filipinos or Mexicans or Orientals. And what happened is that the growers would offer more money to the packing shed workers so they wouldn't join the strike. And that's what broke the strike up. And so the packers went, the packing shed workers went back to work. The Filipinos were still, the field workers were still on strike, and that just broke the back of the strike. So the growers got what they want.
He was talking about
in 1935, Salinas lettuce workers won a raise to 35 cents an hour. Emboldened by their victories, throughout the 1930s, farm workers struck all over California, often successfully.
So you can imagine, they were arguing between 75 and $1 an hour. It's kind of shocking to think about the amount they were paid for the hard work that they did. Next slide, please. So this is the short-handled hoe that Al Baggio was talking about. You can imagine what it does to your back. You have to bend over to use it.
It was finally outlawed, but not until the 1970s and 80s. Next slide, please. That's Al Baguio and Jess Tabasa, who was very interested in Filipino history. The two of them had a lot of old photographs that we went over, both from Salinas. Next. Andy Imiton, along with Cesar Chavez, often doesn't get credit for how much he was part of the United Farm Workers Union, but he was very integral in bringing together Mexicans and Filipinos, because if you could pit them against each other, you would not be able to have a union. But by the time they realized that they weren't the enemy of each other, that changed everything, and they actually created the UFW together between the Filipino farm workers and the Mexicans. And Andy Imiton talks about that a little bit here and how he wanted to represent Filipino workers. That's him on the left, too. Andy Imiton arrived from Manila in the early 1960s and helped found the United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez. Imiton says as soon as he heard about the laws forbidding Filipinos from marrying whites, he committed his life to helping the men achieve justice.
You know, some people are trying to avoid the issue, putting them under the rug, but I want to talk about it because it's unfortunate that the whole generation of people were subjected to the anti-miscegenation law, which was the cruelest law that any human being can ever devise for another human being. You know, when they came to the United States, they were poor. When they died, they were as poor as when they came to the United States. And that's how many years? 50 years? Working hard? I was listening to the deliberation in the meeting, and they were telling about being sprayed with pesticides while they are working, very low wages. They were not included in any labor laws. I thought that United States led in everything, actually, and I thought there was equal rights to all the workers. Unfortunately, it wasn't.
The thing that makes this part of the story so remarkable is they believed it. They bought it. They bought the idea because they read it in the school books that hard work will get you somewhere, and that America is a land of opportunity and equality. Every year during the 1980s, the coroner in the county of Santa Cruz would go in, would have to get guys that had dropped in the field and died while working. 80-year-old men standing down on a corner, getting on the truck and going out and working in the morning.
Next slide, please. So we move now to the next program, which was about the Dust Bowl and Depression. This is even before that, actually. So a lot of Europeans were part of farm work immigration, especially in Watsonville area. And as you look around Watsonville, you see a lot of the place names are Croatian. This is a picture of John M. Lukrich apple growers. This was a long time ago, right, when they had to bring their apples to market in a box pulled by 4 horses. So you see them lined up along the streets there in Watsonville. Next slide, please. Here's some Croatian apple pickers from 1913. They look pretty dapper. A lot of them knew nothing about agriculture when they came. They came from the Dalmatian coast of Croatia. They were living, a small village lifestyle, but more metropolitan than where they had arrived at in Watsonville. But they needed an occupation, and so a lot of them brought over apples from Europe and began to cultivate them, and also from Russia. There was brands of apples they brought with them, and this was the work they decided to carve out for themselves because they saw a niche and they were good businessmen. Next. You might have heard of Gizditch Ranch, and they're in farming since she was a small tyke. She still runs a U-Pick operation in East Watsonville now, and you can still get the best pies in the world from there.
But she said a lot of time people would ask her, well, where do you travel when you go on vacation? And she would just laugh at them and said, what's a vacation? Actually, I don't take them. She's amazingly hard worker. And she's still running the little gift shop there. It's like a thrift store. Next picture, please. Here are some beautiful pictures of apple labels from Pajaro Valley. This was from Pajaro Valley Historic Association. Some wonderful artwork here. Next. This is Jerry Martin. We'll hear a little bit from her. She was a Dust Bowl person who came to Watsonville with her family eventually.
This was where the fruit tramps would have all lived. Many of these places they might have stayed in all year long. Gone off to the Imperial Valley, gone off to the San Joaquin Valley, and then come back to the same place. My grandmother was born in Arkansas and my grandfather in Missouri. They both ended up in Oklahoma. They moved out here, I think, around 1921, before the Dust Bowl had wreaked the havoc that it eventually did. So they thought this would be their big opportunity. They came to California and followed the crops up and down the San Joaquin Valley and into El Centro, that area. Eventually, in working in the lettuce, as they became involved in the lettuce in the 30s, late 20s, early 30s, that's when they came to Watsonville, Salinas.
Filipinos are trying to organize. Some of the Mexicans are starting to organize. And some of the Okies are starting to organize. This is a very tumultuous time.
Next slide, please. That was Sandy Lydon, by the way. Thanks, Sandy. So here's packing shed workers. These are the women I mentioned before who worked in the packing sheds. Mostly men in the fields, and the women were in the factories, basically putting them in boxes, trimming them, doing whatever washing. It was also very hard labor where you would stand around. And as Sandy mentioned, the Dust Bowl refugees also organized. Let's hear the audio about kind of the labor unrest during the Dust Bowl time.
Welcome to Pastures of Plenty, a history of California farm workers. Hard times in the country. I'm Luis Valdez. In this program, we look at the Great Depression through first-person stories. It was one of the most tumultuous times in farm labor history, as epic battles raged up and down the state, and the huge agricultural industry teetered on the brink of collapse. In the mid-30s, Dust Bowl refugees flooded into California, competing with immigrants from Asia, the Philippines, and Europe for farm jobs. It was a recipe for racial tension, but also for labor organizing. Today's farm labor force is mostly from Mexico, but in the 1930s, it was a patchwork of people, many of them of European descent. What greeted them was some of the hardest kind of labor on earth.
We spent 31 picking hops in out of Sebastopol. I was probably wasn't even 11 years old then.
There were people living in shacks made out of orange crates. One family with a whole lot of kids were living in a piano box.
So we got a tent that was just a little cover over a bed. That was our house. But I remember sticking out our hands, out of the covers into the rain, to get our hands wet.
Dorothea Lange's pictured us as having great despair. I remember nothing but laughter and happiness. I had a wonderful childhood. We weren't ever hungry.
I remember nothing else to eat. My mother fixes gravy and biscuits, and I'd go out and get some tomatoes and squeeze them in this gravy and eat it. Tastes pretty good.
They gave me a bucket and a ladder and sent me into an apricot orchard. And there were braceros in the crew there with me. And I'm hotshot, college bound, math and science whiz in high school. Jock. Man, they had me cold. Took about an hour and a half. And I knew that, man, this is not only hard, but skill. There's skill involved in that.
Okay, that was Sandy Lydon again. Next slide, please. That's Ed Maples. I think we're going to skip ahead a little bit. He was the person you heard with a very deep voice. He had a story about his brother and he bringing some extra food they had to a migrant camp where people were starving during the Dust Bowl. And this man refused the food because he said they were communists and his children were starving. And it just reminded me of some of the states that refused to accept unemployment money from the federal government, saying, no, thank you, we're fine when people are starving. It was really sad that even food became politicized. Here he is pictured in the Steinbeck Museum. Next slide, please. This is Ivano Camelli. I want you to hear a little of his accent. He farmed up the coast. The Italians were another group of people that came in and farmed Davenport and around that area. During World War II, they were told they couldn't farm anymore west of the highway because they thought they were going to signal the submarines with their flashlights. They were basically assumed to be traitors to their own country, as were the Japanese. So let's hear a little bit about Ivano Camelli and what it was like on the Davenport side.
My name is Ivano Franco Camelli. I was born and raised in Santa Cruz County on the Coast Road, about 3 miles north of Santa Cruz, and I lived with my family, and we're looking at the fields out here. They're bare today, but my father, who was an immigrant from Italy, in 1923 worked these ranches from 1923 until almost when he died in 1983. You can see, well, you can't see on the radio, but I am dressed as my father would be in his rancheri outfit, which was Levi's and an old brown shirt, and he used to wear a hat, and he used to have usually his tools with him, and his tool was la chavala, which is the shovel.
Okay, next slide, please. Whoops. So the Bracero program came next in the late in 1942, and this was a program that was planned immigration. The arrangement was usually with one grower, so these workers worked for one grower, but they weren't allowed to move around. So there was quite a bit of difficulty they encountered, and sometimes a lot of wage theft. Next slide, please. This is Ignacio Gomez Rodriguez, who came to Salinas as a bracero in the 1940s. He lost a lot of wages and had worked for many years with the Mexican government, trying to get them to pay what was owed, because they were supposed to get a portion of their wages paid by the Mexican government, and the Mexican government reneged on their side of the bargain. I believe they might have finally got $10,000 before a lot of them passed away. So let's listen to a little of his story.
Ignacio Gomez Rodriguez came to California from the state of Michoacan as a young man in the 1950s to work in the Salinas lettuce fields.
I came
to the U.S. in 1959 as a bracero.
Siempre en México, en todas las comunidades pequeñas,
the small communities in Mexico would always get a notice from abroad saying that they needed bracero workers.
Nada de esto, nada más trabajo.
Well, the biggest promise of the program was just to come here and work, and that was basically it. Come here to work. No salary or no wage promise when we first got the notice. We were just offered work, work, and work.
La primera vez que vine yo a Estados Unidos, viene uno como todo joven.
When I first came, I came with the illusions that every young man has. I had dreams and aspirations and promises that I've made to myself and to my family members. So I was very excited and very anxious to start working.
Un día típico del algodón, pues la ropa la teníamos mojada.
I mean, a typical day for us picking cotton was drenched in sweat. Most cotton plants are up to 6 feet tall. Some were smaller, but for the most part, they're very tall plants. And having the hot sun beaming over us and the humidity of the ground under us would just make us drenched in sweat.
Next slide, please. This is Leon Ventura, who his daughter, Ana Ventura Ferris, was the first Latina mayor of Watsonville, elected in 1996. And he went from a bracero to being an inventor. He's still alive. She's taking care of him right now. He's got Alzheimer's. But I was really happy to interview him. Here's him talking a little bit about coming here to Watsonville.
My name is Leon Ventura, and I was born on Jalisco, almost by the west coast, close to Puerto Vallarta. And I came back as a bracero in the 50s for about 2 years.
How did you hear about the bracero program?
Well, was very, everybody know about it in Mexico by that time. By that time, before that was on the 40s, was when the United States were at war. There were a lot of people came from Mexico to work on the fields and also on the railroad tracks. And by the 50s, it was almost 100% on the fields. Well, the roughest part of the bracero program was that you had to live on barracks with another 50 people. Some were noisy, some were drunk, some were good people. Sometimes it was hard to get a good night. Got with my wife one day and I thought we want to make a lettuce packer. And I got a box, empty carton box, and put it on another empty box and start working with it. The first time that we did it with toilet plungers.
He went home and sketched a design for a mobile lettuce packing machine, which would enable a crew of 30 workers to trim, bag, and load their lettuce into boxes, putting it onto a conveyor belt.
There was a man working on the shop, on the fabrication shop for the company. His name was Javier Infante. Very good friend, very intelligent man, so I told him my project. And I showed him how I did it, and we started working on it. It was a success. They're still using it. It's a very, very clean operation. The machine is still working, and I think the company still gets the...
So imagine someone without a high school education.
Tomatoes were...
Pause it. Just imagine that. Someone being able to invent something who didn't have a high school education or any engineering background, just figured it out. Next slide, please. This is Clem Perez. He is a father of a friend of mine, and he was a labor contractor and had to kind of be in the middle between the growers and the workers. Next slide, please. You've all heard of this gentleman. This is a photo by my dear friend, Bob Fitch, who I wanted to honor today, dedicate this slideshow to. He passed in 2017, much too young, and his entire archive is at Stanford University. But he took this iconic picture that ended up as a postage stamp image. He also took an iconic picture of Martin Luther King that ended up as the statue of him in Washington, D.C. But he was there photographing the movement. Let's listen to a little bit of Cesar Chavez and when he was very young, talking about what led him to become an organizer. This is, I think, from 1972, this interview with Studs Terkel that he did.
My father made the resolution that no more work. If he doesn't pay us right now, we won't work. So we got in the car and went over to see him. When we got there, the house was empty. He had left. And so we went to the winery, and the winery says, well, we're not, we paid him. And they showed us where they had paid this man, but this man had taken our money. So we're completely broke. And we borrowed some money and moved down to West Fresno County to a cotton. In those days, a lot of the cotton was picked by hand, so went to his camp and got there, and it began to rain, and we couldn't work. The following year, we had what I consider to be one of the worst experiences. Was we got stranded up in Oxnard. Oxnard is the lemon center, one of the large lemon growing areas. There we couldn't get a house, so we got a lot right at the end of this subdivision and put up a little tent. So we got a tent that was just a little cover over a bed. That was our house. And it used to rain on it at night, you know, laying there and damp and cold and raining. And the fact that we were kids, you know, we were at that point you can take all kinds of punishment. But I remember sticking out our hands, you know, out of the covers into the rain, you know, to get our hands wet.
Next slide, please. So this is our narrator, Luis Valdez. We're going to go through a couple more slides more quickly because I'm getting slow on time. He also grew up as a farm worker as a child, remembering his mother moving the cradle in a fruit box down the row as she worked. Next slide, please. This is Armando Asensio, who was a member, he was a field organizer for the United Farm Workers Union. We'll hear a little of him talking just about well-picked and how it was to be part of a strike.
Okay, right here is the Free Speed Company, the fields. This is the first company that started the strike. The first company, 1970, okay? I'm working right here in those fields. My first day, really, I wasn't understand anything about unions. For me, it's something really very new. One guy, name is Marshall, coming to talk to us about the strike, about the union. I don't know nothing about it. When my first time I picked up the plow, really I scared. Okay, you know why? Because I know my boss fired me right away anyway.
As word of the strike spread, more and more crews of Mexican workers walked off the job in adjacent fields.
Next field is another one, it's the same company, have another crew, and talked, hey, you know what? It's on a strike. Huelga. Why? Because we need the contract. Okay. But the final free speaker say, okay, they sign a contract.
But in 1970, Salinas Valley, with about 15,000 workers, for 6 months of the year, produced 80% of all the vegetables sold commercially in the United States. Unbelievably productive people. You could go out there, and if somebody gave you a lettuce knife, you could like bend over and cut a head of lettuce. It isn't that difficult. But to do it 6, 7, or 8 hours a day, to decide between which ones have to be cut this time through and which ones don't, to get the 24 heads of lettuce and put them in a box, to do it at a speed where you make very much money, you couldn't do it. One of the really wonderful stories about the 1970 strike is that the strike was so effective that the growers decided that as kind of a demonstration, they and their families would go out and they would cut celery themselves. They would cut the celery themselves. Well, in one of my most favorite incidents in California agricultural history, they got all the press there and television cameras and press there. They could not pack one box of celery.
That was Frank Bardicke, another historian that was part of this series. I'll just show you a couple more slides because I realize we're getting short on time and I want to make sure you have some time to ask a few questions. So let's just go through the other slides really quickly. Here's some images of the strikes in the 70s in the Salinas Valley that he was just talking about. Another one with the cauliflower harvest. Next, please. These are some young UFW workers I met in Watsonville. Next slide, please. This is their office. Next slide. Here's some workers at Driscoll that I interviewed. And this last series of photographs were the marches that happened in 2006. The last big immigration marches. I think there was 100,000 people that came out in Salinas and something like 50,000 in Santa Cruz. And we don't have time for the audio, but let's just scroll through some of the images that we took when we were there. Next, please. Next, please. And next. This is in Santa Cruz. And the last slide, please. These are the people I'd like to thank, and I'd like to thank you for being here and open it up to any questions you might have. And I'm sorry we ran a little bit over on time, but we started a little late. So I wanted to make sure anyone who wants to say anything has some time, and thank you so much for your attention. I just want to say, too, it was such an honor to be able to work on this project, and so amazing to meet all these people and have them tell their story in their own words. You know, I don't come from a farm worker background, but I wanted to have this story told, and I'm really happy I got to do it. Lori or Lisa or Diane, does anyone have anything they would like to add or any questions? Thank you so much for being here and for listening to this presentation. And if you want to hear this again, the whole series is available. Sarah, yeah. Thank you so much. If you want to hear the whole series, you can go on prx.com and look for Pastures of Plenty, and all 4 one-hour pieces are there. So it's 4 hours of these. And this was just a taste of what I did. So if you want to listen to the whole thing, please, maybe it's prx.org. Let me get you the actual URL. Here we go. I'll put it in the chat so you can all have it. It's prx.org. I apologize. There's the 17144 number that will get you to the Pastures of Plenty site. And thank you so much for being here. It's my great pleasure to present today.
So I don't know if anybody can see me, but this is Diane Cowan. And I just want to thank Rachel Goodman. I am just flabbergasted with the breadth and depth of this program. And I just want to thank you for sharing it with us today. And I also want to thank those of you who came for this, our last in the Book to Action program series. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Pastures of Plenty, I hope you'll do so. You can pretty easily find it on ksqd.org as well. That's how I listened to it. I'd also like to encourage you to fill out the survey when you receive it about this program to help us improve our offerings in the future. And thank you all so much for spending a little bit of your Saturday with us. Have a great day.
Thank you, Diane.